Hi everyone, and welcome back to Rough Rider, where almost every week I talk writing, self-publishing, and making it as an author. So I talk a lot about sci-fi, but let's talk about fantasy today. And what would fantasy be without a little magic? If you're writing fantasy and you decide that you want to incorporate magic into your novel, you're going to have to decide what kind of magical system you're working with. So here's my breakdown of the types of magic that you could use for your fantasy novel. First kind of magic is low magic. Okay, so let's set the scene. We've got a lonely young man heading into the shadowy woods. Then he finds this crumbling hovel in the middle of the woods. Like he almost doesn't notice it, it's so overgrown. And before he knows it, he's sitting down with the village witch. All the grotesque ingredients to her potions is just littered all over the place. It's like something right out of Sleepy Hollow. But she asks him, "Why are you here?" And he tells her that he's looking for a girl to marry. And immediately she knows what to do. She hands him a red candle inscribed with magical words. She rubs some rose oil on it and mutters something under her breath. Then she gives him the candle, and that night he lights it before he goes to bed. He lets it burn through the night, and then he meets his future wife the next day. Anyway, that's probably not a story you're gonna see in a fantasy novel. That's like a little kid's story. But the point is, this is low magic that you're dealing with. In the real world, like anthropologically, you could just call this folk magic. But these are simple practices that could be performed by both lay people and adept magicians alike. It'll also involve short, easily recited spells and rituals. And the goal of such magic is usually to address the problems of everyday life. It'll be like money, romance, health, safety. It could be any of those things. These are just things that everyone experiences. So you can attract wealth, or you could attract love, or you could curse your enemy, any number of things. And usually you'll see the use of magical objects like talismans or amulets or charms. I would say usually a magical professional is the one who's crafting and distributing these, but they're available to the everyday people who seek their services if they pay the fee. But back to how this can relate to fantasy, this is easier to incorporate into a story because it doesn't require any sort of elaborate rituals or ceremonies to work. But if you do decide to go with this kind of magic, it's going to require you to invent some magical objects or little short spells that your characters can have access to and recite themselves. Anyway, this kind of magic isn't the really showy, flashy kind. This is more the kind that you're going to see in the real world. And when I say in the real world, I'm not saying that the magic is real. I just mean that system of magical thinking is real. There are people who adhere to things like this. Doesn't mean that the magic is real, but they are performing these rituals. They are doing these little things. But yeah, if you know anyone who's into Wicca or neo-paganism and stuff, this is the kind of stuff you're gonna see there. I'm Christian now, but I used to be into this kind of thing for a really long time. So some of this I'm writing from experience, but that's a subject for another day. Okay, and then the second kind of magic you can incorporate into your fantasy novel is high magic. Here's another scene for you. You've got an old mage in flowing white robes, standing in a darkened room in the middle of a ring of flickering candles. And he's got a ritual circle inscribed on the floor. And on top of the altar in front of him, he's got all of the magical tools for his ritual. He's got magical blades, wands, chalices, everything he's gonna need to perform the ceremony at hand. He takes a deep breath. He recites a whole elaborate series of magical formulas, and he makes sure to pronounce everything perfectly, because just one mispronounced syllable and the whole thing falls apart. Or even worse, he could die. So yeah, that's high magic. So this is the kind of elaborate ritualistic magic that in the real world you would probably call ceremonial magic. You can think of this like a pagan version of a Catholic mass. It has all the pomp and circumstance, but instead of trying to commune with God, you're trying to impose your magical will on the world. But with this kind of magic, you have to follow the script to the letter. The ritual, the gestures, the words, they're all vital and they're pre-scripted. They're followed the same way by everyone who is practicing this. If you mess one thing up, then either one, the ritual won't work, or two, it could just be dangerous for the person performing it. Plus, these rituals can take a long time. You can't say these spells in a few seconds like you could with low magic. But if you want to go with this kind of fancy, big, dramatic sort of magical system, something that is so formal and so ritualized, then you're going to have to consider the fact that the characters who are performing it really need to be people who are trained in this. Only advanced magicians are going to practice this kind of thing. A layperson might even put themselves in danger if they try to attempt it. Actually, that leads me to a side note. When I talk about high and low magic, it doesn't necessarily indicate how strong that magic is. This is just describing the methods by which that magic is either released or controlled. That being said though, high magic tends to be depicted as the more powerful of the two. Low magic is going to be the kind that addresses everyday affairs, while high magic most of the time is going to be shown as a way of averting natural disasters or altering the course of history, doing something really big. Of course, you can go against that trend, and there is nothing wrong with that. Don't think of these as something that is necessarily more powerful than the other. They're just different ways of explaining how the magic is actually used and wielded. But anyway, when we're talking about high magic like this is really good for fantasy authors because it allows you to do something super dramatic. It's great for a really climactic moment, but you can easily make this into a turning point for your plot. Okay, and then the third kind of magic you could write into your fantasy novel is natural magic. Got another image for you. You have a young girl who was born in a village on the sea. She feels at home in the water. She probably spends more time in the ocean than in her own bed. And one day, her mom goes out to call her daughter in for dinner. And to her shock and awe, her daughter is surrounded by a swirling cyclone of water. Just with a wave of her hand, the waves obey her. To that girl, commanding the sea is as simple as taking a breath. And that's natural magic at work. It's an innate supernatural ability that doesn't require any magical words, objects, or rituals to activate it. You can look at these like superpowers, I guess, or psychic abilities. You have characters that are born or trained to develop these magical talents that are usually, but not always, unique to them. So you might have one character who can start fires with their mind. You might have another person who can control the wind or start storms or something like that. Every person has their own particular talent. But no matter what that talent is, the point is that these abilities are something that someone naturally possesses. So unlike high or low magic, natural magic works by the magician just thinking about it. Kind of the same way that I'm moving my arm right now without me having to command it to move. That kind of magic doesn't need to be explicitly invoked. You're just born with it. And in terms of incorporating this into fantasy, I would say this is probably one of the easier ones to add into your story. You don't have to invent any spells or rituals or magical items that people are going to use. All you have to do is decide how these supernatural powers are going to be distributed and how they manifest in people. So is this something that showed up from the time they were an infant? Was this something that started when they were a kid? Does this usually happen at puberty for people? You need to think about how these people are actually going to get these powers. Like, can someone lose those powers? That's a good question. Or do they have them for life? Just make sure you think about these things if you decide that this is the kind of system you want to incorporate into your story, because you want to make sure you're consistent. Okay, and then the next type of magic you can incorporate into your fantasy novel is divine magic. Okay, I got one more scene for you. You've got this really disheveled, just run down looking guy in a dark room. He's a mess. He lost his job, his wife left him, and he just feels like his world's falling apart. So in a state of desperation, he decides he's going to make a deal with the devil. He'd sell his soul in a second for a chance at prosperity. And an old grimoire he found online told him how he can do it. So he draws 2 circles on the floor just as he was instructed to. One for him and one for the demon he's about to summon. He takes a breath and he recites a spell in Latin. He has no idea what he's saying, but he's making sure to say it right. But then once the candles burn out and he sees 2 red eyes glowing out from the shadows, he knows he's made a mistake. So that's divine magic at work there. You could consider it a form of high magic in that it usually will require some sort of ceremony to work. But the difference is that high magic will either tap into some sort of inner wellspring of magic that the magician has, or it will draw from some sort of like universal source of magic, like this really very abstract sort of thing. It's almost like the Force in Star Wars. They'll be drawing off of that. But then with divine magic, it's not that. Now the magician is actually like enlisting the help of spiritual beings. And these are intelligent spiritual beings. These are not like just a force or something. This is a actual personal being, the way that we would talk about God or angels or demons that have a will, they have a consciousness. And when it comes to this kind of magic, it could be good or bad. So it really doesn't specify what kind of divine being they're dealing with. It could be angels if you want, if it's supposed to be good kind of magic. It could be demons if it's bad. It could be nature, spirit. It could be really anything. It really just depends on the goals of the person practicing this magic. If they want to do something bad, then you're probably going to deal with the stuff that's coming from hell. And if you're dealing with something good, probably heaven. And if it's neutral, maybe the earth. But no matter what spiritual being they're summoning up, the magician almost always has to protect themselves from it. It's usually going to be with a magic circle or a barrier of some kind. When you stand in the presence of that kind of spiritual power, it really takes a toll on mortals, so it's better safe than sorry. When it comes to writing this into a fantasy novel, there's a few things you're going to have to work out. Like I was just saying, you need to think about what spiritual being is being summoned and why. Think about the person's motives for summoning them up. what kind of favors they're going to be asking for, and just generally like, is this a good thing or a bad thing? You could also think about how high ranking this is in the spiritual hierarchy. Are they beseeching just some low-level demon, or are they like calling on one of the big guys, like a deity or something? And if it is a deity, do you have a pantheon of gods that you can choose from? You need to think about that while you're world building. You need to have the kind of gods that they can pull from here. And then when that spiritual being does show up, what kind of precautions does the magician need to take? And I think the biggest question of all is probably, what is it that that spiritual being is expecting in return for their services? It might not be the most savory thing, and you could have a lot of fun with that. Anyway, if you're writing fantasy, your readers are probably going to expect a magical world. Of course, not all fantasy novels necessarily have magic, and if they do, it's not always super prominent. But I would say that magic really is a hallmark of the fantasy genre. You don't really see it elsewhere. So I'd say there's a good chance your readers are going to be expecting a spell or two when they pick up your novel. So while you're in that world building stage, you should think about what kind of magical system you're going to use if you do decide to incorporate magic into your novel. Think about which one works best for your plot, which one works for your characters, and then just make sure you're consistent with it when you start writing it. You don't want one mage to abide by the rules and then have another one break those same rules and have no consequences. But by having a concrete system of magic that your characters can wield, your fantasy world is going to be as perfectly magical as your readers are hoping it's going to be. Anyway, I'm going to do a quick plug here. I think everyone should go check out my friend Naomi's Kindle Vella series. It's called The Whispers in the Mountains. I'm really proud of her that she's been doing this. And this features natural magic. But yeah, each of these characters kind of has an innate ability, and that really is a strong plot driver for it. So go check that out. I'm going to link it below. And if you want to read this in written format, if it's easier to understand than me just rambling, go check out the blog version of this. There's also going to be a link to that in the description. If you've thought of other kinds of magic that you could use, because I'm just using ones that I know from real world type magical systems. So these are things that I'm basing off of my own experience, but I'm sure that there's other systems that could probably be used. So if you know that and you like to write it, then put that below. But if you found this interesting or helpful, please like and subscribe. Follow me on social media. And as always, thank you for watching. God bless.